All right, welcome to the November 2nd edition of Going Viral, Going Viral News. My name is Jim Dingeman. We're going to spend a few minutes on the headlines today, and I'm going to start with what has occurred in Glasgow. Biden is basically criticizing Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping for not showing up. They made a big mistake by skipping the talks. We'll get further into that down the road. Biden says that Joe Manchin will vote for the reconciliation package. And it turns out that over the weekend, the head of the Progressive Caucus in Congress met with Kirsten Sinema, Congressman Jayapal. So we'll see what happens. They seem to also be reaching a compromise on the big pharma drug prices. Again, one does not know how this is all going to turn out, but it is seemingly not having an impact on the race in Virginia, which a lot was being talked about as essentially a precursor to what may happen in the midterms. And as we speak right now, Youngkin is leading by a substantial number of votes. I believe at least 100 to 200,000 votes in the state of Virginia. But what is important is the exit polls show that the major issues that affected the voters in Virginia, in this order, are the economy, 33%, education, 24%, taxes, 16%, and COVID-19, 13%. And the issue of the school curriculum, in terms of the voters being asked, is 53% of the voters of Virginia are very concerned about the school curriculum issues, 31%, some of them. So it means essentially that the argument made by the Republican Party to strategize and erroneously attack and falsify the question of education over slavery, education over the dimensions of the true history of the United States worked in terms of misleading the voters in the state of Virginia. So a lot of them are coming out. I believe the McAuliffe comment where he made the statement, well, you guys don't have anything to do with the educational system, worked. And they're making a big deal about the fact that the beloved novel by Toni Morrison, a very powerful novel, by the way, is something that offended them. So again, the issue of, frankly, racism works in terms of negative voting and, of course, falsely stirring up the people of Virginia to not view wanting to have their kids get exposed to more nuanced and essentially more realistic view of American history seems to have worked. Now, in other news internationally or nationally, it turns out that the African National Congress in South Africa is also experiencing an election, and it's on the course for their worst performance ever in local polls. In the case of super polluters around the world, there is a whole big thrust with Facebook that 10 publishers on the Facebook pages are being attacked by folks calling for change with Facebook because they're denying the climate crisis around the world. We have today CDC advisors recommending the Pfizer vaccine for young children. There is a state of emergency being declared in Ethiopia as the Tigrayan rebels gain ground. There's a call for a mass mobilization. We also have activists inside Poland. In other words, the United States, with the we just yesterday had the arguments in front of the Supreme Court about abortion laws in Texas. Well, it turns out that activists in Poland are also actually, some of them have been killed in the wake of them protesting stricter abortion laws in the very conservative milieu of the government in Poland these days. Now, I just wanted to make some comments about day two at the COP26 roundup before we turn to the issue of Taiwan and China and the United States. We have basically leaders agreeing today to end deforestation. Biden has announced a pledge to cut global methane emissions by 30% by 2030. We have the United States has rejoined the High Ambition Coalition with the aim of achieving the 1.5 centigrade goal at the climate talks. And there is another initiative, the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda, which is a plan to coordinate the introduction of clean technologies. Their cost has been agreed at the COP26 summit to be incurred by all sorts of future leaders. African countries will spend $6 billion on various measures, and there is attempts to try to deal with the island of Palau essentially being overwhelmed by climate change. It's a series of islands in the Pacific that its very existence is being threatened by the rise of global warming. And finally, there was a much publicized song that Greta Thunberg said today, which is basically the climate change leaders in their talks. Remember, she was very famous recently for the blah, blah, blah comment. Well, today, of course, she basically said they can stick it up their ass. So that's some of the headlines in the news today. Now, in terms of China, one of the issues that came up was Xi Jinping's not showing there. And of course, the issue of the question of China's acceleration of coal production. And basically, the argument being made is that since China is now accelerating their coal production, and they are one of the substantial polluters in the world, it essentially makes the issue of any kind of mitigation by 2030 to be impossible. So that it was probably well-intentioned for Xi Jinping not to show up, because he would have gotten clobbered by all the other leaders. Again, they're not perfect in all this, but they would have essentially said, well, you're not doing anything to mitigate coal production because it's so important to your economy, yet your production is going to impact the ability of the world to have any sensible goals by 2050. Now, in the midst of that, we have continued escalation of conflict in the South China Sea, all on the coast of China, vis-a-vis the question of China in relationship to not only Taiwan and the other powers, but also the whole question of China and the whole issue of coastlines. What is whose? Is it 12 miles out? Is it 200 miles out? And we have all sorts of arguments being made. Now, the issue of Taiwan and China itself has been an issue that has not gone away since the culmination of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. And to shed greater light on it, we're very pleased to have Brian Xu on the line with us today from Taiwan. He's the editor of New Bloom magazine, which is a radical online journal. And Brian can tell us what it's all about. So we have to have Brian on mute, but once he's unmuted, he can sort of get into it. Yes, Brian, how are you today?
Good, yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Brian, what's New Bloom magazine?
Yeah, so we were founded in 2014 in the wake of the Sunfire Movement. Sunfire Movement was the student-led occupation of the Taiwanese legislature for 1 month. We were participants in the movement, and a lot of the issues that came at stake in the movement could not be solved except on an internationalist basis. And so we felt the way to do that was to build a multilingual, primarily English and Chinese, publication to conduct dialogue with other social movements on the left internationally. And so we've been publishing in the 7 years since then in both English and Chinese. And so I was one of the participants in the movement. I was one of the students that charged on that day and participated in the major following actions. And New Bloom was what came out of that with the group I participated in.
Okay. Now, as we, I'm going to assume that some of our audience is not necessarily familiar with the complexities of Taiwan and its relationship to the United States and the People's Republic of China. So I'm going to want to get your take on how things have evolved up to now. First of all, what is your opinion or take on the essentially Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang imposed martial law when they crossed over with several million people in 1949 in the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War, and they imposed their regime on Taiwan. But tell us how you understand how this has evolved to, let's say, the period of time when Chiang dies. In other words, during that period of time, there were several crises between the People's Republic and Taiwan that were essentially came close to war between with the United States involved. You had the Kuomintang actually arguing in the 60s that they want to invade the mainland, and that was prevented by the United States for a whole variety of reasons. But what's your assessment of the impact of the Kuomintang's role and rule of China of the Republic of China up to the early and mid 70s.
Yeah, so I think maybe I should go back a bit and talk a bit about Taiwanese history. So the last time the same polity controlled Taiwan and the Chinese mainland at the same time was in 1895 under the Qing dynasty. And even then, it did not control all of Taiwan. So around 88% of Taiwan's population is from these earlier waves of migration to Taiwan. 2% of the population is indigenous. Sometimes there's the misperception that Chiang brought over several million people with the KMT and that they are the ancestors of all the people in Taiwan today. That's not actually true. That's a minority of people in Taiwan. I mean, my family was actually descended from the KMT. But then they constituted a ruling political and economic elite during the decades in power, during the authoritarian period. That took place during what at the same time was called the White Terror, with tens of thousands of purged, killed, including leftists, dissidents, others, people that are inconvenient for the state. And so in this sense, Chiang fits the classic pattern of a right-wing dictatorship backed by the US for the purposes of anti-communism. And so that's how we can understand these efforts by him to try and invade China, or because he moved to Taiwan as a staging ground to try to get back to China eventually. But that possibly did not happen. He died in Taiwan. His son took over. The possibility of retaking China as a military conquest, putting the KMT back in power, became impossible. And so that sort of does bring us decades later to where we have today. The KMT is pushing for the political univation of Taiwan and China. It doesn't care anymore about if it's in charge. It's fine to acquiesce to the CCP, its historical enemy, but it just wants to see unification for its ideological purposes, for its own sense of nationalism. Another factor is that because of democratization, which brought the Democratic Progressive Party to power, they lost some of the privileges they had as a political and economic elite. Perhaps they think they can regain this if they facilitate the unification of Taiwan and China.
Okay. Now, one of the things that's, because you have a knowledge of the domestic impact of this on the United States, the United States, in terms of its relationship to China, goes back to the late 18th century, the early 19th century, and all the issues of trade with China. But I wanted to concentrate on the 30s and the Second World War to start with. We had, of course, the perception and selling of China in the United States during the period of the Japanese aggressive wars in the 30s. And of course, their taking of Taiwan is due to the first Sino-Japanese War back in the 19th century. But focusing in on that, this question of how the United States perceived China, and FDR was rather clear that he wanted to set up a post-war structure where the Kuomintang was his ally, his partner, inside ruling and controlling China. And that, of course, fell apart as a result of the Chinese Civil War and the victory of the Chinese Communist Party over the Kuomintang. And then you fast forward, that remains an issue in the Cold War, is obviously one of the reasons why we support the Chinese, the Kuomintang. And then we get to the point where we have Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger deciding quite cleverly to take advantage of the Sino-Soviet split in 70, 71, 72, rumored, of course, in 69. The Soviets supposedly asked the United States, well, would you guys tolerate it if we use nuclear weapons against the mainland? And during the Ussuri River conflict between the Chinese and the Soviets. And so set the stage for that. How do you understand how the three communiques have evolved, the Taiwan Relations Act of 79, and this whole question of our relationship with Taiwan leading to the present in terms of the United States and its complicated domestic politics?
Yeah, so I mean, for example, China was an ally of the U.S. in World War II. I mean, you have these posters go around like "good Chinese, bad Japanese," and pointing to these physiognomy, like differences or whatever. And this was rather absurd. But then after Chiang comes to Taiwan, there's the notion then circulated by the U.S. that this is free China, this is legitimate China, that this is the ROC, government in exile, and that the PRC is not legitimate. And this changes because just you cannot ignore China. You cannot ignore the ruling force of China, the PRC. It's large, it's powerful, it has consolidated its power at that point, etc. It was not going to go anyway anytime soon. And so one of the options that the U.S., one of the options that came up for Chiang was dual recognition at the UN, for example. Chiang did not want to take that. He did not want the ROC and the PRC to be recognized at the same time. And so he withdrew. And so then that points to some of the evolving complexity of the U.S.-Taiwan relation, in which, for example, the current stance on Taiwan is strategic ambiguity. The U.S. does not actually make it clear if it would intervene on Taiwan's behalf, because with a claim that this would perhaps precipitate more aggressive Chinese action if it did have a position of strategic clarity. And so the position on Taiwan then is officially unofficial. What's interesting is that there is the U.S. one China policy, and there is the Chinese one China principle. And China oftentimes will try to conflate the two. Sometimes it is successful in conflating policymakers, getting American policymakers to make it as though the two things are the same thing. The official U.S. stance is that Taiwan's status is undecided, but China often frames it as though the two have an agreement that Taiwan is part of China, which that's China's one China principle, and it will also cite, for example, UN resolutions to back that claim. And so, I think it's quite interesting, because I think it's an example of how the U.S. does not want to increase support for Taiwan, because if things were to become too dire, then Taiwan is not a battlefield the U.S. would want to fight on. It would probably abandon Taiwan to China in that sense. Despite all this talk of commitments and etc. And so this complexity still exists, still persists, and still a very salient political issue.
All right, let's explore the domestic complexities on Taiwan. One of the comments you made during this teach-in that was co-sponsored by a whole variety of organizations. I think Code Pink was involved, the SANE Committee for U.S.-China Policy, which I agree with in general. I mean, the thing, to me, the worst thing that could happen is a terrible, savage war. But one thing that seems pretty clear, at least in the left, is that their idea of the politics on Taiwan is essentially not realistic, or basically based on their images of what they think happened in 1949, that it just stayed there, a bunch of reactionaries in charge, and that essentially us maintaining the desire to have a nuclear war to defend them is ridiculous. And I wanted you to sort of get into what the domestic politics are and what your critique of how the left in this country and probably around the world has looked on them.
Yeah, so I think this is quite interesting too, because a lot of people have stayed in this sort of time warp in which they think of Taiwan is still ruled by Chiang or something of that sort, that Taiwan is still right-wing, that the KMT is still in charge, etc. And the party that is currently in charge is the Democratic Progressive Party. It's a party that emerged from the democracy movement. It is a center-left party. It has the word progressive in its name. There are some issues on which it has been more progressive. It legalized gay marriage, being the first country in Asia to do so, for example. But it's not the KMT that's in charge now, and the DPP that is currently in charge leans towards Taiwanese independence. There's the irony of then that what is a more left-leaning party that probably would do well with constructing more ties with other, leftist elements around the world to push it further to left, because in the beginning, actually, of the founding of the party, there were radical left elements in the DPP. It's thought of as though it were the same as the KMT. And so sometimes when I'll end up hearing is these kind of KMT talking points regarding then what Taiwan needs to accept is one China, and this is a way to avoid conflict. One China, as I mentioned with my outline of Taiwanese history, the last time that the same polity controlled both Taiwan and China was in 1895. It's 120 years. Even then, it was not all of Taiwan. And so you can see why, for many Taiwanese people, Taiwan has never been part of China. And if you look at just history, the recent history of the last 70 years, the PRC has never controlled Taiwan. And so I think you have this conundrum then. I think people don't really know what the viewpoints of Taiwanese are, or that even have a viewpoint, that they do think of themselves as separate from China. I also think that the notion of a nuclear war over Taiwan is somewhat overblown at this point. China does not have the military capacity to invade Taiwan. It would be too costly. It would precipitate basically a collapse of regime for the CCP if it were to attempt to do so, in terms of the amount of troops you would have lost, the economic impact, etc. This is not a risk and take at present. However, acting as though Taiwan is already on the brink of nuclear war and the only option is just to then engage in policies of appeasement over Taiwan, I think it's very much just overstating the case. But you do have then military officials in both the US and China ramping up this threat to justify military budgets and their own raisons d'etre, their own positions, and the importance of their positions.
Well, it's funny. I myself have been the umpire in open war games that simulate a war between China and the United States over Taiwan. And what I always found fascinating is that I was actually the PLA commander in one of those games, and I sank 3 American aircraft carriers. And so I had to stop the game and discuss with the people there. I said, well, this is in Washington. well, what would happen if 3 aircraft carriers were sunk by China? I mean, what would the United States reaction be? So that part of it I do understand, because I could not see the United States not responding dramatically with in an escalatory situation like that. And that brings me to the question of, how do you see this aspect of what's going on? I mean, how do you understand? Because the whole conflict in the South China Sea, it sounds like the People's Liberation Army and Navy and Air Force have essentially extended their control into South China Sea to, one, control natural resources, two, to control global shipping lanes, because trillions of dollars worth of trade go through there. One can understand that. On the other hand, they expand their ideas of territoriality and economic zone boundaries, so that you just give the U.S. Navy and its allies a excuse to have freedom of navigation patrols constantly in there, which one should note they suspended at certain times. There was a period of time when they just didn't do that. So what do you make? How do you? And then one thing that was interesting when you were talking with the people, the professor from Bucknell and Mr. Clare, was the issue was, how does a radical opinion deal with this dilemma? What do you think?
Yeah, so it's one of the important questions, I think. And I think the left sometimes does not think about this. The left is oftentimes not prepared to talk about military affairs because it has ceded this territory to the right. And so one of the reasons then China is interested in the South China Seas is these shipping lanes passing through the region, potential resources that are underwater, etc. But then other countries would find this threatening. I think just China's actions towards Taiwan, for example, would upset Japan. Okinawa, for example, is geographically closer to Taiwan than it is to the rest of the Japanese archipelago. And there are U.S. troops there, of course, but even I think the Japanese government would have to respond in some respect. I think then also one can think of the enormous troop losses that China would have if it were to not mount a invasion of Taiwan. It doesn't even necessarily need to get to the point of the U.S. being involved. I mean, some estimates have it that 500,000 losses would be the largest naval beachhead invasion since D-Day, effectively, just in the sense of transporting that many troops over, getting past mines, etc. And Chiang did not choose Taiwan for an incorrect reason. He chose it as a place to mount a stand in the case of a invasion, and Taiwan has literally had decades to prepare for that. And so I think then the task for the left is how to avoid this bloodshed, because it benefits nobody. It does not benefit Taiwan. It does not benefit China. And so how do we prevent this kind of escalation from happening? And I think that's the challenge for the left today. But I think a lot of the discourse gets caught in just, for example, the talk last week, the conclusion was, Taiwan needs to accept one China. And that really misses the point that one China never really stuck to Taiwan. It never really works as a discourse. And this has become all the more case in the past few decades, in which the KMT is no longer able to win elections. The DPP does seem like it will probably maintain power. And young people increasingly do not identify as Chinese in any form, but as Taiwanese. And people don't want to join the military. Nobody wants a war with China. But, then China is still getting more aggressive in terms of its actions. In October 1st to October 5th, there were 150 Chinese airplanes that went into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. That is, past year, there were 680 airplanes, and 150, around 20%, occurred within 5 days.
Right. You look at the Republic of China Ministry of Defense radar daily tracking, and they're always going in there. I mean, but I should say, of course, I had friends of mine who were in the U.S. Air Force, and they were on missions like that all the time with the People's Republic, and we do the same thing to them. We just want them to turn on our radars. You want to figure out their air order battle, their electronic war air order battle. And what always amazes me with those missions is they tend to all be concentrated to the southwest of Taiwan. Which what I found fascinating is that if one looks at the operational plans to invade Formosa, Operation Causeway in World War II, they were all oriented to the southern part of the island of Formosa, or Taiwan. So again, who the hell knows what's going on? But let me bring other people on. Alex, why don't you join in with your comments and questions? Alex?
Okay, Brian. Yeah, it's great to, very interesting. I wonder, are you familiar with Peter Lee's China Threat Report? Because he has some interest. Well, he has one of the it was interesting you mentioned Japan, because one of his things is he thinks Taiwan takes a lot of cues from Japan in terms of Taiwanese kind of wanting to be close to Japan, having their support in any potential conflict with China, but also that they look to Japan as kind of their a connection to the U.S. and that they kind of run, in a certain sense, run their foreign policy, and their that the current Japanese shift towards well, I don't know, I guess we could say well, I don't want to say militarism, but certainly more active foreign policy again. The helicopter carrier that they're turning into an aircraft carrier now, and more assertive military and foreign policy from Japan. So I wonder where you think that and how far you think Japan would go to support Taiwan, both before a conflict and in a potential conflict.
Yeah, I would strongly disagree with that. Taiwan's link to the U.S. is the U.S. There's major historical, links, for example, with the U.S. In terms of just the history of the Changs, but also this, mass history of migration of many Taiwanese to the U.S. to settle down during the authoritarian period. And so Japan actually was rarely ever discussed in the kind of thinking in the public consciousness about defense from China. Usually, you only have discussion of the U.S. actually, and then Japan comes in as an afterthought. And so this actually seems very strange to me because I think the general public might be like that. There's also a lot of cultural fondness of Japan. For example, there are many people whose grandparents grew up during the Japanese colonial period, speak Japanese. Their kids maybe grew up in an environment in which there's a lot of Japanese anime and pop culture exports and that sort of thing. There's a lot of travel to Japan. Aid from Japan in times of natural disasters is high, and so donations from Taiwan to Japan has also been high, such as after the Fukushima incident. That contributes to goodwill on both sides, and that furthers these kind of ties of coming together. But again, I think that the issue for the left in Taiwan is that then these people that speak up for Taiwan in Japan are extremely right-wing. The LDP, I mean, that's which has controlled Japan continuously since World War II, is very right-wing. And for example, under Shinzo Abe or his family, with his political histories as a dynasty going back to the Japanese Empire, they really have this revisionism going on because they want to restore the glory to Japanese Empire by reinterpreting the Constitution. So to get around Article 9, for example, forbidding fighting war except in defensive, self-defense, etc. And so one of the issues then at stake is Taiwan, and Taiwan makes a very convenient wedge point for the conservatives in Japan to push on this issue to fulfill their domestic goal of reinterpreting the Constitution. And this is a very similar position to Republican hawks in the U.S. who will then increase support of Taiwan just to stick it to China.
Okay, and one other question I had is, some other kind of Chinese Americans I've heard talk about the history of the left in Taiwan. Of course, they bring up, the kind of white terror that the KMT had in like the 40s and 50s, especially. And some will kind of bring up the idea that, well, there is really that similar to South Korea, there really is no real left in Taiwan. That it's historically been so thoroughly crushed that, well, particularly again, any kind of left that would go towards socialism, again, because of the whole anti-communist history of Taiwan. And brutal repression at times. And so I wonder what, as a leftist yourself, what do you think about that argument?
So it is true that there is a historical suppression of the left from the KMT, and a lot of the people they executed were leftists, for example, people that they thought of as pro-China and accused as communists, etc. But then you also do have the ground cleared because the KMT banned leftism for so long, cracked down on all these Marxist texts, etc. People started interested in leftism because if something the KMT banned, maybe it's good. And so then you have strange cases like at NTU, National Taiwan University, there's the famous Mainland Club. And this was like the only place in Taiwan in which people were allowed to read Marxist texts for the purpose of criticizing them and debunking them. The end result, they all became Marxists. And so this includes even people such as the former Taichung mayor, Ding Jialong, who is a DPP politician. He even himself, he's far from a radical today, but even someone like him had a flirtation with radicalism. There's someone like Su Bing who died 2 years ago at age 100. He was born in 1917 or 18 or 19. And he is one of the quote unquote fathers of Taiwanese independence. And so he is someone who educated during the Japanese colonial period, converted to Marxism, went to China, worked with the CCP, eventually disagreed with him, came back to Taiwan, tried to execute Chiang Kai-shek, failed assassination attempt. That did not work. So fled to Japan. And then he wrote one of the kind of groundbreaking works of Taiwanese history from a Taiwan perspective and not a Chinese perspective. And so there's this tradition. It still exists young people that participated in the Sunfire movement, for example, were interested in these texts. And talking to these people that had radicalized in the decades prior out of resistance to the KMT. And so these people are still around today. I mean, New Bloom, I when that was founded, it was just I was hanging out with a student group that was reading like Marx, and that's what partly our origin. And so that's I would say that this still exists today, but something on a concerted, organized mass scale, it doesn't really happen, which I think is the case with the left in many places.
Well, one of the interesting I've seen in Nation General recently is the massive strikes in South Korea. Like, I think it's over 500,000 workers on strike. So I wonder if you could say something about the labor movement in general in the history of Taiwan.
Yeah,
so I don't know anything about it.
Yeah. There's an interesting book. The title escapes me at the moment, but it is comparing the labor movement and the environmental movement between South Korea and Taiwan. And the argument is effectively that the South Korean labor movement is very strong, whereas labor is weak in Taiwan. But by contrast, the environmental movement is very strong in Taiwan because it aimed to incorporate the demands of labor. And I think that is quite a convincing argument. Labor was put down by the KMT. They used a system, the system of unions was used as a way to control companies and workers to make sure that production quotas were met, for example, in terms of production and manufacturing, etc. But then you have, it's very much tied with the identity trends then, or attempts to break out of the KMT party state. And so you do have the unions being formed in like the 2000s that were more green, that say they're more DPP leaning or more identified with Taiwan, versus these KMT unions that were dominated by people that are close to the party and had this vision of Chinese nationalism, but also were just deeply wedded to the party state. But then I think you also in the union movement have the long-standing issues between independence and unification. A lot of these people worked together, for example, during the democracy movement to fight the KMT. But then once the KMT seemed to have overcome, they started splitting along these issues. And so you do have some leftists in labor movement that are very pro-China, see China as a kind of socialist utopia, etc. And, much more pro-independence labor movement as well in some respects. But overall, labor still has these issues, I think, getting out of the state. A lot of times the demand from labor is calling the state to intercede in a labor dispute. And so that actually, it's actually just very difficult to escape the state. And I think that really does go back to the legacy of the KMT party state, even now post-authoritarian period.
And I got one last question. Since obviously Taiwan went through the Asian development model and it's, building its economy, and also, of course, I know Chiang Ching-kuo, Chiang's son, who ran the government for some time, was actually, he went to the Soviet Union. He lived there and he actually, as I understand it, used a lot of kind of almost communist style development. Again, rapid development, lots of heavy industry, and I wonder if does that trend Taiwan in any way towards?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Yeah, so Chiang Ching-kuo had even flirtation with Trotskyism when he was in China. He eventually brought his Russian wife to Taiwan. His children were half Russian, half Chinese. Right. But yeah, the interesting thing is that I think one has to keep in mind the rhetoric and discourse of socialism is so prevalent that even after Chiang gets beaten by the CCP and comes to Taiwan, he writes a book called China's Destiny, and he's still saying that, well, now we need to create socialism now. And so even Chiang Kai-shek himself was talking about socialism. That didn't mean a lot, but it's still present in the discourse. And so then this does have an effect in that you do have leftists that really, their vision of leftism is associating leftism with China, or their notion of leftism is still influenced by the KMT in some state, by this kind of rhetoric and is taken in. And so I mentioned the identity split between the pro-unification and the pro-independence kind of labor organizer leftists. Well, some of the pro-unification leftists then actually joined the KMT, despite having spent decades fighting against the KMT. And so what they were driven by was these kind of identity concerns. And I think also just the notion that there is still this socialist kind of appeal within the KMT. And so, for example, there's a very famous Trotskyist that later joined the KMT as a spokesperson. There was a huge scandal among the kind of labor movement that he would actually do that. He died actually fairly recently, 2 years ago, in a drowning incident, which was very unfortunate. But that was something, for example, that did occur within the labor movement. Yeah.
Alex, let me bring Michael in. But as we're bringing Michael in, Brian, and we'll come back to everybody. One of the things that always I can't wrap my head around is that these countries are integrated economically. I mean, when you look at how when Deng Xiaoping opened the economy up in the mainland, you had a lot of Taiwanese investors go into the mainland. And one of the things that you raised was the Taiwan miracle, like all the South Asian, all the Asian economic miracles of the post-war period. and in particular semiconductors, which is so. I mean, I was wondering if you could go as Michael comes into the dialogue with us. Could you shed light on that, the integration economically? Because obviously, when one looks at all this bellicosity going on, you see at the same time, what's going on economically? Is there sort of is the mainland basically saying, okay, go to hell, guys, we're going to cut you guys off? What's going on?
So this is actually a very, very interesting question too. The paradox of how economically integrated Taiwan and China are. I think like 43% of exports go to China or something crazy like that. And then, vital supply chains such as regarding semiconductors. Taiwan produces half of the world's semiconductors. And so, it's very common to talk about a new Cold War nowadays. But a way in which the current Cold War is very different is the US and China are deeply economically interlinked in terms of manufacturing, in terms of markets for each other's goods. But then Taiwan, for example, has the paradox of that even its own semiconductors are in Chinese cruise missiles pointed at it. And so the question then is, there would be enormous economic impact to China if it were to invade Taiwan. And so China actually does not want to mount an invasion. It would actually prefer to be able to take Taiwan peacefully. And so that is why, for example, using the KMT as its domestic proxy in elections is so important. For example, semiconductors. If you want semiconductors, it's not like oil. You can't just go in and take it because this is infrastructure. You really have to minimize damage. A lot of it's know-how among people. You don't want to end up killing your technicians that you want to run these plants when you come and take over. And so that makes it very difficult for this to happen. And so then Taiwan is in a very contradictory position. I mean, China, its economy would go into crisis if it attacked Taiwan because they're so deeply interlinked. Just Taiwan's economy, 20th or so largest in the world, would have global economic impact if it were to face a Chinese invasion. And so then that's, I think, the point in terms of looking at this kind of bellicose rhetoric is stepping back. It's actually hard for China to do this. But then, perhaps if China is acting irrationally, if Xi Jinping needs to manufacture a crisis to expand his power, Taiwan might be an option to do so. And what's interesting, too, is that there is a kind of class of businessmen that move between Taiwan and China and do business with both, oftentimes operating factories in China because labor is cheaper. The most famous of these is obviously Terry Gou of Foxconn infamy, just all the workers jumping off factory buildings and that sort of thing. And he is very close with the KMT. He tried to run for their presidential nomination in 2020. This class of people is called Taishang, referring to businessmen that do business back and forth. And the China's really try to cultivate them as a voting bloc that will vote in favor of a KMT. And so there's suddenly a lot of fights, for example, around elections just for them to go back. And China really also tries to win over Taiwanese young people through economic incentives for entrepreneurs and people starting up businesses, etc., because it knows it's lost a generation of Taiwanese young people in terms of identity trends.
Right. Well, just as I bring Michael in, last week we saw that in Germany, the influence of the Confucian Institutes had actively intervened, which I thought was absolute stupidity on China's part, to prevent a book on Xi Jinping to be published, which was, because all that's going to do is make that book a bestseller. But Michael, I mean, it was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But Michael, your comments about this before I bring Kenny in. Mike?
You got to mute, Mike. Jim, maybe we should bring in Ken and then go to Mike.
Okay, I'll come in.
Hello?
Oh wait, there's Mike.
I've been on for a while. Brian, can you hear me? Brian?
Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay, good. You're the only one who I care about that hears me. Okay. So I have a couple of questions. One of them is, well, first of all, it sounds like, and please tell me if this is an oversimplification, and if it's even correct. It sounds like the people who were formerly the most right-wing and anti-communist are now somewhat in favor, or for the most part in favor, of unification, even to being subservient to the People's Republic. And shall we say, people more on the left are opposed to interference or being united in an unequal manner with mainland China. Is that? I mean, to me, it sounds like an oversimplification, but is that for the most part true?
Yeah, a shift in terms of its identity or its stance on China, rather. Just pro-China identity takes precedent, and so it doesn't mind if it becomes, Taiwan becomes part of China in that sense.
So that's a very interesting point. And also the idea of even if you talk about Marxism or the interpretations of Marxism, just as China's interpretation, Mao's interpretation of Marxism differed from the Soviet interpretation of Marxism, because of course they have two different types of societies. One was supposed to be a workers' paradise, and one, using the lingo of the time, was a peasant's paradise. Would you say that also there's a marked difference and conflict between it seems like you were indicating that, between the Marxist movements in Taiwan and the political environment on the mainland?
Yeah, that's right. So I think just in terms of economic basis, for example, Taiwan was modernized under the Japanese, whereas that almost not the case with China, for example. Just it did remain for a large part semi-feudal, semi-colonial, as Mao would say. That it's very rural. There's a lot of farmers, agricultural, etc. And so the exposure to Marxism is also quite interesting. I mean, for both Taiwanese and Chinese, a lot was actually through Japan, through students that studied in Japan, and then were reading these translations of Marxist texts or other Western kind of philosophical or sociological or texts, etc. In Japan. There was contact between both groups in Japan, or just as part of this kind of broader discourse. For example, there's a famous Taiwanese author, Liu Nao, that went to Shanghai, for example, and not exactly a figure of the left, but anyway, he's an example. But then just, yeah, I think there are these kind of diverging paths. And so again, like someone like Su Bing's historical trajectory, in which he did go to China and work with the CCP, later came back and broke with them, etc. That is quite interesting, that there was this contact. But I think that, yeah, it does diverge at a certain point. I mean, particularly after 1950, just then, the notions of Marxism do differ substantially. Though there is still contact. I mean, you do get, leftists in Taiwan that are more pro-unification and do idealize Mao, but they don't talk about Mao directly in the way that I think Chinese Maoists would. And so I think that difference is actually quite interesting. Yeah.
So basically, this is not a political a battle between political systems. This is simply a, shall we say, colonial/imperialist in conflict in the traditional sense, which is that the mainland wants Taiwan reunified and part of the People's Republic, part of their society and their government, and Taiwan doesn't want to be, wants to be separate and independent. But it really has nothing to do with or very little, or less, I should say, to do with the political systems. That's what it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Yeah, I think particularly today, in the past, for example, the KMT be like, well, we are capitalist and they are communist, what have you. But then actually you can point to a lot of structural similarities in what they do. For example, land reform. Land reform was something the KMT carried out in Taiwan as well, similar to what the CCP did. There's when you have the Deng free market reforms, China is looking towards the East Asian tigers as a developmental model, for example. And so I think particularly now, in this case, in the present, at this juncture in the 21st century, the differences are much more minimized. Whereas in the past, the KMT would hold up this kind of difference in economic model to appeal to the US regarding capitalism versus communism. Also Christianity, Chiang Kai-shek converted to Christianity, for example, and that inflated his appeal for the US, etc. But now, not particularly so.
Frank, you got any more questions? Excuse me, Michael, anything else?
Yes, the question to bring us up to date, these air incursions by military air incursions into Taiwanese airspace, which has been so much more frequent and much larger in the past couple of months. Do you think, what do you think? Because obviously, and I would tend to agree with you, that it would be too costly for People's Republic to actually invade Taiwan or go into a full-scale amphibious invasion and basically a full-scale war with Taiwan. What do you think the purpose of these incursions, this kind of saber rattling, would be? I mean, obviously, it doesn't sound like the Taiwanese would be. It sounds like most people in Taiwan would agree with you. That's my impression, that it would be a little too costly for the mainland to invade. So what do you think China, or the mainland, People's Republic, hopes to gain by this, for lack of a better term, saber rattling?
Yeah, so there's multiple reasons I think for this going on. For example, you don't want a Taiwanese population that's going to fight against you and resist in the event of an invasion. So you want them afraid and demoralized and too afraid to resist. And so carrying out constant threats is one way to do so. It doesn't really work, I think, because China hasn't really built a narrative of successfully of developing, progressing threats. It's more just monotonous, and threats have gone on the decades, and people just tune out really fast, and so that hasn't really worked. But then you also want to prop up your domestic political force, your proxy within Taiwan, that is to say the KMT. And so saying, well, with the DPP in power, we're going to keep threatening you. But if the KMT comes back to power, we're going to stop with this. That's kind of what they're trying to do in that sense, in trying to prop up their domestic political force. But there's a third angle too, which I think is also very important, is that this is not only directed at Taiwan, is also using Taiwan as a proxy for the US, threatening Taiwan to scare the US. And so, for example, some analysts have interpreted that these flight paths that they're to the southeast and southwest of Taiwan, instead of crossing the median line of the Taiwan Straits, which is more like northwest, this is meant to signal at the US. And China intends to send a signal about its military capacities with, for example, conducting nighttime flights, with having a mix-up of bombers and fighters, etc., to show that you could bomb Taiwan, or that these are nuclear-capable bombers, etc. But yeah, I mean, also the thing about the southeast, southwest, it came up a little bit earlier, is that there are only certain numbers of beaches in which you can invade Taiwan from that are large enough to do that. So you only have some windows to actually mount an invasion per year at these beaches too, and so it's a lot of this kind of rehearsing for this future possibility of an invasion, which everyone has had decades to think about.
No, thank you, Brian. And so it really basically sounds like.
Thank you, Mike. I think we're having a little trouble with your equipment. Can we go on to another question from another participant?
Bring Frank
Okay,
in.
Mike.
Bring Frank in, Ken.
Frank, you want to jump in? Yeah. I think Frank is going to mute.
Yeah. There he is. Got him. Now we got Frank.
And you got to mute Michael and me.
Mute the rest of us. No, I got it. No, mute me. I'll mute me.
No, we're going to Frank.
Hello. Yes, hi, Brian. One of the fundamental points is that the United States has to be convinced about Taiwan and its capabilities to defend itself. And Tsai Ing-wen is aware of this. She's, as I've just read here, she's just about to put this all-out defense mobilization agency into being in 2022. And this is basically sort of guaranteeing to the rest of the world, but particularly the United States, that it can defend itself. Now, you yourself said that many young people are somewhat blasé about this threat from China because you somewhat dismiss it. Now, I'm not a lefty, so I'm not absolutely convinced about that. And one of the main key points is that if China wants to do this within, Xi Jinping's lifetime, which would, his productive lifetime, i.e. around about 2026, 27, then I think, as you've already mentioned, they're going to work with the KMT, but more importantly, they're going to work to alienate the United States from Taiwan by persuading the United States isolationists that Taiwan cannot defend itself. And obviously Tsai Ing-wen is trying to prevent that perception coming through. Now, the Wall Street Journal recently said that the reserves in Taiwan are not very good. And she wants to dispel that idea. But see, what I'm getting from you is that there is a sort of reluctance on the part of the vast majority of youth to really get into this defense mentality. I mean, this is actually somewhat critical. And there's also cultural influences from China that you may dismiss, but it's actually impacting the rest of Asia. In that, for instance, let's say the Hollywood is being censored out of Asia, okay, and that's a big deal. So, your thoughts on this from a young person's point of view? Do you really believe that China can actually prevent the United States from defending Taiwan by influence?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Yeah, it comes up a lot actually, that because young people are not interested in joining the army. For example, now in the time you need to be in the army has been reduced, but even then, still young people don't want to do it. Okay, sorry to Hamarko. Just they do, for example, substitute military service instead. And oftentimes, if they do join the military, their work just consists of sweeping floors or carrying out chores. They very rarely fire live rounds within their few months, 4 months of military service, etc. And so it's not thought that this leads to preparedness. However, I think there's reluctance to abolish the mandatory military service, because that means that in theory, if there was a Chinese invasion, every member of the male population knows how to use a gun. And so this is still a deterrent. But then there's also reluctance to put money into military budgets from voters. And this is something that's consistently shown by polling. And so then the U.S. response is, well, Taiwan is not interested actually in defending itself. And so why should we bother? It's just a risk, etc. And I think it's quite interesting because, when one looks at polling, for example, young people overwhelmingly identify as Taiwanese and not Chinese, but they prefer maintaining the current status quo rather than having a formal declaration of independence or unification. Unification is out of the question for young people, but they don't really want a declaration of independence either, because that may lead to reprisals from China or a loss of American support. And I think this is perhaps correlated with a low willingness to join the military, in that people just want to be left alone. They don't want to fight a war in order to realize something. But in that respect, then, that is a very good question about the media, because my generation, the people are, let's say, 20 to 40, we remember a time before China was big and powerful, etc. The rise of China effectively occurred in the last, let's say, 15 years or so. The Beijing Olympics is a pretty good time to mark the entrance of China to the world stage in this kind of as a rising power. But people that grow up with China as being strong and powerful, if there's concern about, for example, Chinese propaganda in TikTok videos, or just soft power through memes and influencers, or just television programs in which Taiwan is always framed as part of China. But then Taiwan is a democracy, and so you can't really censor this kind of stuff either. And so that is the contradiction. I mean, you have some of this panic in the U.S. too, and you do have some of this concern in Taiwan as well, actually. And sometimes it is from conservatives and just conservative hand-wringing about foreign influence or whatever. But yeah, there's the concern that maybe young people will not necessarily they will always just be attracted by China as a larger economic power. And so this is what China really tries to sell itself towards young people, that if you want to survive, or you want to make money or whatever in this time of global precarity, well, you better come to China and get out of Taiwan. That kind of claim. And so that's how they really try to pull Taiwan in economically, because again, they really do want to avoid a war in that respect, because of the fact that it would be so costly for China.
Okay, so do the Taiwanese youth actually expect the United States to come to their assistance, or do they have a naive outlook on that? Because you see, in the United States, there's a counterpoise. There's those who are starting to believe that committing to foreign entanglements is a dumb thing, and many young people can probably identify with Taiwanese about military action as being retarded. You know what I mean? And so I'm not quite sure from what you're saying that Taiwanese, particularly the young, they don't appreciate that the United States is not guaranteed. It's not this big eagle that's about to spread its wings and come to the assistance of Taiwan. It actually has the same kind of reticence. Do you think that needs to be reminded? Do the Taiwanese need to understand that that's not a guarantee?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things. I mean, just young people in general, I think, do have idealized attitudes of the U.S. I think this is true across a lot of the countries in the Asia Pacific that have hosted U.S. bases, for example, that this is encouraged, or the countries that are under the American protectorate, idealization of the U.S. You also have, global Hollywood, that's also soft power. But then you talk to young people who are more in government, I think they're more skeptical because I think they're more aware of this pushback, this protectionist pushback, or aware of Trump. And Trump, I think young progressive people are always dealing with the contradiction of that. These Trump and these hawkish Republicans seem supportive of Taiwan, but then they're doing all these terrible things that they would not really support in terms of domestic policy in the U.S. And then I always wonder about these Republican hawks and how much they love Taiwan. Well, if they're a Google search away from discovering that Taiwan legalized gay marriage or what have you. So then squaring that contradiction is difficult. I mean, I also think the DPP is not stupid. For example, in 2012, Taiwan tried to run for office for president then as well. And the U.S. tried to sabotage her. They preferred having the KMT in power because they thought of her as a dangerous pro-independence provocateur. And so a phone call was placed to the Financial Times from the White House saying that America does not have faith in Taiwan. And this was the thing that sabotaged her campaign in part. And so I think that does illustrate how Taiwanese voters sometimes do think about which candidate will be able to maintain this relation with the U.S. in terms of their voting, but also when the U.S. has really tried to throw the DPP under the bus. And the DPP has never forgotten this. And so they were very wary of when Biden came to power that will he do the same thing? Because this occurred under the Obama administration, and Biden was, of course, the vice president, and much of his foreign policy staff does have a background in the Obama administration.
Yeah, well, on those same lines, it's now Biden in charge. And did the Afghanistan debacle influence news media there, and particularly, that understanding that we could ditch an ally at any moment? Is that coming clear and sound through to Taiwanese?
Yeah, that came up very strongly. And so it became a major KMT talking point that, the U.S. is not actually that reliable because of the fact that, you look at Afghanistan, that's an example. And so that was brought up in domestic discourse pretty strongly. I think it's very unfortunate that it ended up being the KMT kind of really monopolizing this point and trying to drive it home, whereas the DPP then had to reassure of, stable U.S.-Taiwan ties. However, I think at the back of their heads, they are aware, again, just that at the end of the day, it's a rational interest calculation. You do have some more kind of pro-independence diehards that are less critical and, not as aware of this. But I think the people around Tai are aware of the kind of U.S. flip-flopping, and I think they're attentive to that. There's concerns that her party in the future could become a little more less attentive to these nuances and more ideologically driven. The DPP has always had the kind of contradiction of that it historically idealized the U.S., despite the U.S. backing the KMT for decades, which was its natural enemy from the democracy period.
Okay, well, I guess the last question is there an animosity? I'm seeing this towards Japan that is going to be played on by China in the next few years to a much larger degree. I think it's starting to work in Singapore for some reason because they're coming out with a film, Train Heroes or something, Railway Heroes. And that's a Singaporean company, which obviously has the enemy as the Japanese. So that's catering to what China wants. Is there a deep-rooted, you've already mentioned this a bit, but I want to concentrate a bit more on it, deep-rooted antipathy towards Japan?
Yeah, so it's very much part of the KMT kind of nationalist discourse, this animosity towards Japan. So among their constituents and their base, they very much drive home this point, celebrating these, historic victories against the Japanese, etc. And so that's another common point with China. And so China kind of tried to push on this point. But however, this is a much older demographic, it's, declining in number because they are so old. And the DPP has always been accused of being more pro-Japan because many of their base is descended from people that went through the Japanese colonial period. But as it happens in Taiwan, the Japanese colonial period was not as severe as in other parts of Asia, such as like the Philippines or Singapore or South Korea. It's remembered it's a time in which infrastructure was built up and a robust educational system was developed. It's really just romanticizing it in light of what happened when the KMT came to Taiwan. A lot of these uprisings against the Japanese are passed over in terms of the historical memory, or that there was a class system put in place for the Japanese. But this has contributed to more pro-Japanese attitudes from the DPP. And so I think for young people too, they don't have this animosity towards the Japanese that maybe their grandparents had, even if they are of descendants from those that came with the KMT. Because a lot of kids grow up consuming Japanese pop culture and things like that, and that is soft power. And it's also a popular travel destination, etc.
Okay, one quick
Well,
question about.
thank you, Frank.
All
Thank
right,
you, Frank. You got some more comments, Frank?
only one. It's what's the attitude, or is there a close feeling of camaraderie between the Taiwanese and, say, South Korea?
Yeah, so South Korea is interesting enough not discussed as much. I think that's really changed in the past, let's say, decade with the rise of basically, South Korean pop soft power has been really on an expand with K-pop and all these bands and Japanese Korean movies, etc., and TV shows. But I think that it doesn't enter into the equation as much as Japan does. I think it's seen as less willing to come to Taiwan's aid in that sense, in terms of, let's say, military or historical ties, etc. And so, for example, I'm most surprised that there's not a lot of South Korea experts in Taiwan. And so, for example, in media discourse on it, there's not a lot of Taiwanese journalists stationed in South Korea. That's always been a little surprising to me.
That's surprising to me too, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think trade ties also are important, but just that also is not discussed as much.
All right. Well, thank you, Frank. And you're listening to Going Wild News. We're talking to Brian Hsu on the whole complicated issue of East Asia and especially Taiwan. Joined on air with us is Michael Jankowitz, Frank Radford, Alex Stavropoulos, and Ken Aaron. Kenny, do you have some comments or questions you want to add before we go?
Okay. Yes, I do. Brian, I wanted to ask you, let me just pull up these questions so I don't waste too much time. How much this one basic question, then just one other. How much time have you spent in the mainland China? Where did you go? That's the first question.
So it's probably the big cities like Beijing, Shanghai, only for vacation really, so weeks at a time. I mean, I have quite a lot of Chinese friends, but it's not a, I don't really have the ability to visit China at present for fear of retaliation. Even if I visit Hong Kong, for example, there's the potential of being kidnapped or something like that. Yeah. So unfortunately, I've never just had the opportunity to travel around China. What's also interesting is that my family, they're all mainlanders actually. So they're descended from the people that came over with the KMT after the Chinese Civil War. And so I do have family in China. I don't know who they are. And I cannot actually, explore China at will at this point.
Well, do you speak Mandarin?
Yeah. So Taiwan.
So couldn't you put on couldn't you like sneak in or disguise?
Well, I mean, they would find me at the border, but just with like based on just at the airports my real name, etc. I think just I am too public a figure for being able to travel to China at this point.
Unless they invited you for a conference or something.
Well, the other thing that's funny is that sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And so, for example, Chinese publications have reached out to me to write on, for example, the legalization of gay marriage in Taiwan. And so then at the end stage, when the article's handed in everything, then they find out I'm on a political blacklist and I'm not allowed to publish in Chinese publications. And so sometimes, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So maybe let's say someone invites me for a conference and they find out, oh, wait, this person is on a list. That could happen.
Okay, very good. Now, I'm a Chinophile or a Sinophile. I like China, mainland China and stuff, the people and everything. This is apart from the government, etc. So my question is, in terms of young people or Taiwanese people in general, what's your viewpoint about the human rights issues that China has? It's soft, like a swamp soft. The Falun Gong, the Uyghurs, the Muslims in general, repressions of Christianity. I did a study of religions in China, and they all have to be approved by the state. There's a Chinese Bible, for the Christians and so forth. They monitor everything. And there's Christians repression, or they claim there is. And then what they're doing to Hong Kong, they had an agreement to do one country, two systems. And they just said, yeah, I changed my mind. Sort of like Darth Vader, just hope nothing else changes, right? The game has changed. And also the way they control the economy. In other words, it's somebody's got a shoe factory, but the government, the totalitarian CCP, owns 51% of it, and they could just cancel it anytime they want. And and then the really, I don't know, I'm just curious if this talk about this is going on in Taiwan, possible organ harvesting of prisoners. And they do have the highest per capita executions, state executions.
Yeah. So I think
So what is does Taiwan pay attention to those human rights issues in China?
Yeah, so I think basically the views skew dramatically depending on who you're talking to in their views of China. And so, for example, there's a famous left-wing sociologist, Wu Jianming. He has a book called The Third Imagination of China. His argument is that there are basically two views of China from Taiwanese. One is idealizing it as a giant business opportunity. It's bigger, it's better, you can make money there, etc. And then you just paper over all these human rights abuses that you've gone over. Then the second view of China from Taiwanese is it's big, it's scary, it's dangerous. All these bad things happen there, and so forth. It's just a kind of bugbear in that sense, or kind of spooky, scary, whatever thing. So he calls for then a third, more critical view of China, in which you take it as it is. You understand that there is civil society and resistance, etc. from young people, progressive people, etc. And he calls for this more nuanced, critical understanding of China. But I think he's totally right that generally views of Taiwanese skew between those two. It's big or scary and whatever, or it's like a money-making opportunity. And then you talk to, for example, like my parents, for example, are very KMT. They view China as having democratized, that all these problems are solved now, and it's far surpassing Taiwan in terms of the size of its economy. And so everything is better there. You don't have to worry about these kind of things. And so there are people like that. And you do get some people, even among young people, are like that. But then I think for a lot of young people, they're just kind of cautious of China. And they do talk about these human rights abuses, but not in any particular detail. It's just kind of scary and abstract. And so personally, I think as a leftist, then pushing for that kind of third, more critical, nuanced understanding of China, in which you can work with Chinese activists and activists from Hong Kong, etc., against the shared enemy of the CCP. I think that's really what needs to happen. But that's harder said than done because, for example, just traveling to China or Hong Kong is difficult for Taiwanese activists now. Conducting exchanges is not really as possible as it was from, let's say, 2008 to 2012 or so. And so that route of creating collaborations is much more difficult now. Even just going to Hong Kong, there are young people that went over in waves to participate in the Hong Kong protests. I myself went over to report on it, but that will also become more difficult with, for example, young people from Taiwan being searched more heavily at airports when they're traveling to Hong Kong. There have been reports of that as well.
Okay, thank you. Those are the only questions I had. Back to Jim.
All right. Well, listen, Brian, it was absolutely terrific to your thoughts. It really was a great pleasure. And I want to thank you so much for taking time with us and really giving us a really in-depth look at your perspectives. We hope to have you on again, and your colleagues would be great to, I think it's important. This is important to flush out. What we're talking about here is important to flush out because, in my case, I can think of all these friends of mine who became Maoists in the United States, people who joined the Revolutionary Communist Party and all the different splits that they happen. And I remember I used to tease individuals. Well, I'd say to them, well, the Gang of Four said this, and I know you have to ape what they're saying, but aren't you being an idiot when you act like that? And then I think of friends of mine who actually suffered in their families through the Cultural Revolution. So, it's a real difficult question to get the radical left in this country to come up with a interesting synthesis about how to look at this whole problem.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely the case. I think just having these kind of dialogues is very important for that. So, thank you for the invite today to do that.
Right. No, well, I'd like to get, because I think of all these friends of mine who worship the individuals who essentially were sort of imbued with, I used to say, when I used to meet friends of mine who were in the Weather Underground, I said, what'd you do, watch the Battle of Algiers on acid too many times? But, the value, and then, of course, people who valorize the Panthers who were, as far as I'm concerned, if you decide to say you're going to wage armed struggle against the state, well, what do you think they're going to do in response? They're going to come repress you. And of course, I think of people who used to go in Berkeley and sell the Red Book uncritically. And so there's a dimension of the left that got radicalized that still is imbued with it, perhaps not young people, because I think perhaps that's a different kind of experience than they had. But this is going to be an interesting question to avoid falling into traps of essentially backing reactionary ideas about how to deal with China. And it's going to be a very daunting task. And this is great to have a dialogue with you. I really, really enjoyed it. But thank you so much,
So did
Brian.
I. Thank you. Thank you to you all.
Thank you. And we were talking with Brian Zhu, who is the editor, one of the editors of New Bloom magazine. But before you go, Brian, tell us the website of New Bloom and what sort of stuff is upcoming in your issues.
Yeah, so the website is a New Bloom, like NEWBLOOMMAG.net. We have another website too. You can find the link on there called Nomads and Island. And so we have reports on kind of currently some stuff on geopolitics, like the CPTPP, which is what the TPP became after American withdrawal. We have a piece coming on efforts to preserve, for example, just historic graves. We cover everything from local politics to kind of international politics in that sense. Yeah, we also run an event space in Wanhua, which is a district in Taipei. It's more working class, quite historic. And so we're trying to organize kind of talks and discussions about Taiwanese history to all who are involved and to facilitate more of these kind of dialogues on the left locally.
Wow. Well, great. And I'm sure you have access to some of the most fantastic food in the world. In any event, thank you so much, Brian. It was a great pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And I'm sure everybody else feels the same way. Okay. Well, let's proceed with other elements of the show. Alex, I'm sure you've organized a wide variety of different things to talk about. So let's hear what sort of things you want to say in the show. And you're listening to Going Wild, GoingViral.news. My name is Jim Dingeman. We were talking with Brian Zhu, one of the editors of the New Bloom magazine. I'm joined on air with Ken Aaron, Michael Jankowitz, Alex Stavropoulos, and Frank Radford. Go on, Alex.
Wait, sorry. Ken, I think you need to open so I can share screen. You're muted, Ken. I can't hear you.
If you just share screen, then I'll put it into session. Just share a screen.
Oh, wait. All right, I think I am. Yeah. Oh, wait, select window or screen. Entire. Okay. I think I'm. All right. So yeah. So
it hasn't come up yet.
Oh wait,
You just have to hit share or hit enter once you isolate it.
Wait.
I have a bunch of things.
Screen. Wait.
I have a bunch of things selected from.
It's saying the browser can't access your screen. What the?
Are you using Chrome?
I'm using Firefox. It should work.
I don't know. So let me read off the things that Jim gave me. Maybe it's already up here. It's not going to last much longer. That's
Let me see. Wait, it gives me the option to share a file. So let me see if that works. No, it can't. Yeah, can't access. Can't access your screen.
What's the thing you want to? What is it that you want to see? Is it a YouTube?
Well, I was going to start with again. There's this very good Australian news outlet, Juice Media. They do parodies of the actual Australian. They have a really good one on COP26. That's about what the Australians are doing on climate change.
All right.
Well, so can you give me a link? Give me a link in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do it. Okay.
All right. Well, while we're waiting for that, why don't I go to the CNN piece that I sent you, Alex? I sent you, Kenny. Pentagon feared Trump would misuse National Guard. Do you have that up there?
Okay,
the
one
CNN
second.
Piece?
Pentagon. It starts with. Yeah, I got it.
Okay, why don't we just display that? We can talk to the outside, then we can go back to Alex.
Okay, as soon as I get it here, I'm going to put it up. There it is.
Failures leading up to the January 6th insurrection. The missteps run the gamut from law enforcement to counterterrorism. The investigation also found some Pentagon leaders feared then President Trump would misuse the National Guard to stay in power, and it chronicles how Trump sat on his hands for over 3 hours as violence escalated at the Capitol. With me now to talk about this is one of the lead reporters on this story, the Washington Post's investigative reporter, Aaron Davis. Aaron, thank you very much for coming on, talking about this important story, and great work to all of you on your team. I want to highlight this bit about Trump and the National Guard. I'll put this up on screen. It says, quote, at the Pentagon, leaders had acute fears about widespread violence, and some feared Trump could misused the National Guard to remain in power. General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then Army Secretary Ryan McCarthy sought to require that only senior Pentagon leaders could approve changes to missions for National Guard soldiers. In the end, that posture contributed to the hours-long delay in getting the Guard to the Capitol to help restore power. So the measures taken to protect the system from Trump, did that ultimately worsen the situation? I mean, in some cases, it sounds like officials weren't cautious enough. It almost sounds like damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, well, thank you. On this particular point on the Pentagon side of things and the National Guard, they had previously said that they were worried about a repeat of June 1st of last year in Lafayette Square and the protesters there that were racial justice protesters who clashed with National Guard and federal law enforcement. And they just didn't want to end up in a situation like that again. They feared that. But in fact, and speaking in much more greater detail with many senior folks at the Pentagon, there was another concern animating their decision to pull back. And it helps explain what was so confounding, or one of the points that was so confounding on January 6th was, why did it take the National Guard to get so long to get to the Capitol? And we did find that in part to insulate the Pentagon from becoming a factor that day, from having military soldiers somehow involved with helping the president stay in office. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Army Secretary, they did put restrictions on the Guard. And these were very specific. They couldn't have any weapons, of course, but no shields. They didn't even have Humvees. They were driven in vans, carpooled to traffic positions. There was even a demarcation line in D.C. where they were not allowed to go east of 9th Street, essentially no closer than a mile to the Capitol. And they were there basically in support of the local D.C. government, which had requested them because the D.C. government felt they needed all their officers available for this protest. So they put them out doing traffic control. And then when things turned bad, it took a long time to get those folks back to the Armory, to get them situated, get to the Capitol.
And the report also details a very telling exchange involving Republican Senator Lindsey Graham as the Senate was evacuated. This is pretty startling stuff. Graham, according to your report, yelled at the Senate Sergeant at Arms, "What are you doing? Take back the Senate. You've got guns. Use them." The South Carolina senator was adamant. "We give you guns for a reason." He repeated, "Use them." Another stark contrast to show how the Republican Party, they've been whitewashing January 6th ever since that day. But at that time, somebody like Lindsey Graham was obviously very afraid of what was going on and was calling on law enforcement there to resort to some very extreme measures.
Yes, Lindsey Graham, Kevin McCarthy, there were a lot of very strongly worded, statements that day, very strongly worded statements directly to the president by some of those lawmakers that day, as we understand it. And yes, the positions that they've taken since then are wholly different than everything we understand about that day, of course. That in fact, the Pentagon, that the Capitol was being overrun, that these lawmakers were in some cases fearing for their lives. And, we've kind of took a little bit different turn in this story where we look more at the 187 minutes in between when the Capitol was breached and when Trump said anything to call off the supporters of his that were raiding the Capitol. And so many things happened in those couple hours. People died. People had heart attacks. There was obviously the Ashley Babbitt shooting. There was just numerous tragedies in the course of those hours when he was doing nothing.
And one of the things I picked up on in the story is that there seems to have been a sense among law enforcement officials, folks over at the Pentagon, in dealing with this situation, that they didn't want this to turn into a Boston Massacre-like moment. Going back to what Lindsey Graham was saying, is if you had officers, if you had people opening fire on the insurrectionists, that this could have just gotten completely out of control and been much more ugly than obviously it was on that day, which was very ugly.
Right. And, you really have to, with everything we've looked at, you have to question why this crowd was allowed to get that close to the Capitol that day. We are able to document, I think, in greater detail than has been done before, that there were warning signs of this violence dating back not just hours or days, but weeks in advance. The FBI had in their possession tips that came from informants, from social media companies, from former national security officials, from researchers that all pointed to a violent situation on January 6th. One particular striking one was December 20th. They received a warning that Trump supporters wanted to not only overthrow the DC police, but to arrest members of Congress, take them and put them on trial publicly for not bowing to President Trump's belief that he won the election. And so, and then, fast forward to the actual day on January 6th, there were signs of violence in the hours leading up to the breach as well. There were numerous firearms taken off members of the crowd after they left the ellipse where President Trump was speaking. And they even surrounded at one point in time parked police officers around the Washington Monument and started beating on the doors there. There were violent signs all the way down the mall as this crowd moved. And yet they basically were allowed to walk straight into the Capitol.
Just unbelievable. And that scene at the Washington Monument, again, if folks should go and read this very extensive report that you guys have put together, but the scene at the Washington Monument is one that I don't think a lot of Americans have focused on, that there was big trouble there at the Washington Monument in addition to what was about to take place at the Capitol. Aaron Davis, thanks so much to you and your team for this terrific reporting. We appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
All right, so that was CNN talking about the piece in the Washington Post that Trump actually replied to today. Over the weekend, he issued normal bullshit kind of comments that he does. But a survey was released today showing that 80% of the Americans feel democracy is under threat. And they were interviewing on the NewsHour tonight election officials of all types around the country who've been threatened, who've been accused of being traitors. We have Tucker Carlson coming out with a movie or a series of documentaries, if you will, arguing that the January 6th demonstrators were patriots. And this is just fucking disgusting. I mean, let's be blunt about it. I don't want to fucking hear any of this bullshit about these people. This is unpatriotic American behavior, period. Simple as that. For them to actually make the distinctions that they're acting in the spirit of those who fought the American Revolution, my relatives were at Valley Forge on both sides of the family. So I consider these people to be un-American, pure and simple. And all their crap about wrapping themselves around the flag and all that, just has to be outright condemned. And I should add that it's quite interesting that it seems that their use of critical race theory, which none of them ever read, and I should say some of the people on the left I know haven't read it too, but anyway, to confuse and agitate and stir up Americans the way they've been doing for the past couple of months has obviously succeeded in the state of Virginia, and it looks like it's going to succeed in the state of New Jersey. The Jersey race between Murphy and Ciattarelli is too close to call, but in the state of Virginia, Youngkin leads by 200,000 votes. And as I mentioned as we started the show, 80% of Americans, 80% of voters in Virginia fell for the nonsense over critical race theory in the curriculum because they felt that they didn't want their little kiddies to understand about how slavery was in reality in Virginia in the 17th and 18th and 19th century. Anyway, others may have different opinions about that. Anyway, let's start with Kenny, because Kenny might disagree with me.
Oh, no, I'm really enthralled to see somebody who could blow his top besides me. It's good to see how visceral your reaction is. I think you're presenting a one-sided issue. This is a country. There's that population in Virginia that are upset about what's happening in the schools. And you're just discounting that because it's not on your agenda. But, we have to be tolerant and accept other people's viewpoints. I mean, isn't that what CRT is about? Let's learn, let's observe what it's like, to grow up as an other. Okay, well, these guys feel like they're being pushed out of the door and they're the other. And I'm not talking about people who get on the microphone and start shouting about how terrible someone else is. But, it's been a while since I've heard that, about a minute and a half. So that's okay. This is just conflict that's going on, and it's politics, and it's okay. And it's going on. It's going on. I'm not going to make any comments about the subject matter, because that should be, if we want to talk about critical race theory or transgender rights and the 150 different pronouns, they should dedicate a whole meeting to that and not just give it a glib reaction. And the effect of it, and of the new 4-star general that was just anointed yesterday. I don't really remember the name, but it's kind of funny. And
the admiral.
The admiral. That's an admiral. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay. Pardon me, man. Your slip is showing.
I figured I would give my kumbaya comments on what I really think. Anyway, let me bring Frank in. Frank, what do you think about all this?
There it comes. I'll put this little thing on the bottom. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, all right. I basically agree with you on 1.6 that it's a disgrace to the core, but I don't agree with conflating it with CRT. I've got my issues with that, because you only have a finite time in school to teach American history, and the way you actually present it to young, malleable minds is really important, and you can turn them which way you want. It's not as if you're giving them the opportunity to rationalize as to whether it's right or wrong, because they're young minds. So it's tough. It's tough for me to really appreciate that this is a good thing. It just is. So, yeah, I understand that there are many things wrong with any people at any time in their history. Now, you can exaggerate that, or you can try and get it into perspective, or you can just be as biased as all get out. So, the impartiality of teachers is part of the problem. Whether you can guarantee that is that's an issue. So, at the end of the day, you've got to have a unified United States. That's the way I look at it. So, if this is it can be proven to me that is in some way the final product, then I try to be open-minded about it, but at the moment I'm not able to see that. Okay, so I have issues with CRT big time, and I also see it as being parallel to other nasty documents in history. I won't go into that, but yeah. So basically, I'm saying that it's wrong to just say that anybody who doesn't believe in CRT agrees with 1.6. That's ridiculous. Okay, that's it.
Well, one thing I just want to add before we bring Alex in is that, to actually have an argument in 2021 about the causality of the Civil War, which undisputably was mainly due to slavery. I mean, it's undisputed. It's a fact. I don't think any of us would disagree with that here. Is to me remarkable. I mean, remarkable. I'm not a liberal in some ways. Some things I am liberal about, politically, but other things I'm not. But to me, it's just, you look at these surveys of American kids, high school students, their knowledge of history. I mean, some of them didn't even know what the hell Pearl Harbor was when they had surveys. So, there's a fundamental lack of sort of basic knowledge. And then, of course, to have people, in this whole Trump neo-fascist movement that we're experiencing right now, asserting that, well, if my kids are exposed to the knowledge that slavery was a factor causing the Civil War, that means they're going to have self-doubt about their image about themselves. That's ridiculous. Anyway, Alex, your comments.
Right. Well, one interesting thing I was listening today again, though, was going on about the Virginia race in particular. They were these Chavo Travels. They're talking, they're pointing out, the right and the Republicans, they're just really good at this kind of repurposing again, left culture war issues, and just doing a much better job on their side to inflame their base essentially with it. So it looks like that's exactly what they've done here. And again, obviously we can, as being on the left, we can say we don't like it. But you have to give them credit that they do a good job of it.
Yeah, let me jump in here for a second. Jim, really, I think this would take hours to go over because there's at least 4 or 5 different points. And, a question of the children being guilty for the sins of their father or their grandfather or their ancestry and so forth. There's all kinds of issues involved here. And with the what was it, the 1619 book? And the project, and the girl got a Pulitzer Prize, and, I don't know what she was or whatever. But it's sort of like, and the reset. There's so many things to discuss on this. I think we should go to. Let's go. Come on.
Well, we
already had all this airtime.
Hold on a second, Kenny. This show, in the past, the people here know we spent a lot of time dealing with the 1619 project.
Yeah,
we spent several shows talking about it. But go on. Let's bring Mike in.
Okay. So maybe I stepped on a sacred cow, but the point is. We all have deep-seated beliefs. So let's leave this topic for another show because Alex has something on COP26, and I got that queued. Can we go to that? Is that okay, Jim?
Well, fine. Let's just hear what Michael has to say.
No. Yeah.
First
of all, I have to say one thing, and I would suggest everybody do this.
Hold it. Mike, if you want to talk, I have to...
Mike, you...
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I think we should talk about one thing. I mean, we're talking about the xenophobia here, which is what this fear of critical race theory is, because I think everybody on the show, if you want to discuss it later, Ken, we should all take a look at what critical race theory is, because God knows not one of the people in the Republican Party who's coming out against it has probably even read past the second sentence of critical race theory. They don't know what it is. Everybody's saying it's this. It's going to get you to doubt yourself. It's going to get people to say, oh, we're no good. All white people are racist and everything. That's not what it is. Critical race
is an example of the I've already made my mind yourself. Shut up,
Ken.
Come on,
Ken.
Michael, you're cheating.
Ken, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Do you want to spend 3 hours talking about this right now?
If you want to, you're not listening to what I'm saying. I'm saying if we're going to discuss critical race theory, then
you're making vast assumptions. You're making vast assumptions and generalities.
I'm not talking about generalities. You tell all I can. What is critical race theory? I can't hear you.
You have to read the documents called Critical Race Theory, an introduction. You have to read the original documents, which were published in, well, some go back to 1999 or some, but I think this was 2017. You have to read the initial documents by the academic people who put forward the idea. You have to go earlier that. You have to go back to Marcuse. You have to go back to the history of it. It's a whole history. It's like Judaism or something. You can't You can't come in the end and say, I disagree with the kosher laws.
No, I've read the critical race theory documents. They were published in the late 70s, early 80s. They have nothing to do.
Okay. Wait a second.
Or nothing like that.
Hold a minute. You guys can rant on. I'm out of this. I will listen. You guys rant.
All right. Look, the point I'm saying, I don't know why. If you think this is a rant, you ain't seen nothing yet. The fact is, nobody. What I've seen is that nobody. Jim has read it. Alex, I know, has somewhat of an idea of what critical race theory is. I have somewhat of an idea of what critical race theory is. And I hate to say it, but from what I've seen, critical race theory has nothing to do with what everybody is criticizing about it, with the criticisms that are coming out about it. It has nothing to do with that. You might as well say that E equals MC squared is also something we should take out of the classroom. The theory of relativity, the general theory versus the special theory of relativity. Come on. I mean, people are actually trying to ban something without knowing what it is. And we've seen that happen before in societies, and it doesn't work out well.
All right. Michael, I do want to move on to what Alex is talking about. You have to mute yourself, Michael. But look, we've dealt with critical race theory in this show over the past couple of months. It is a theory that came out of critical legal theory in the late 70s. And then it was devoted, the devotees, Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, all these people. There are readers that deal with critical race theory. It's absolutely nothing to do with what is being argued about in these ridiculous fights in Virginia and elsewhere in the United States. And people are arguing that one of the issues raised by the very clever Senate Bill 8 in Texas against abortion is that they will apply the same logic to avoid federal intervention because the whole thing of basically inciting people to be vigilantes. Someone will introduce a view. Someone's actually talked about introducing a bill that will ask people to bring up critical race theory. If anybody's using it in a public school system, they will be sued $10,000. The same kind of logic with Senate Bill 8 in Texas. So this is a very clever part of the Republican Party strategy. And the point I raised, earlier was that most Americans can't even pass the basic citizenship test. Americans don't know who Benjamin Franklin was. They only a quarter of them can correctly answer why we fought the Revolutionary War. 12% think that General Dwight D. Eisenhower was a leader of troops in the Civil War. So there's a basic lack of understanding of American history that this whole argument about critical race theory reveals. But on that note, I will refrain anymore from comment. Let Alex get into the issue with COPE 26.
All right. Ken. So can you ready the clip? And let me just introduce it before we start. Oh wait, is that? I don't think that's. Is that what I sent you? Wait.
Off the ground, but the Great Green Wall finally seems to be making progress. 8,000-kilometer long mosaic.
Wait, I think that's not.
Okay, give me a second. Let me get you sent.
It should be again. It should be. It should say honest government ad. That's the.
Okay, 1 second. Let me get to comments, private chat.
It's the last one. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah. Let me do this here and open this.
That's not Australia. Even I know that.
Okay, and let me try.
Okay, this is. I'm going to share it. This very, very funny Australian media company that does the kind of parody ads of actual Australian government, video. So again, this is essentially making fun of the fact that they're screwing the environment in Australia. But it's they do their ads are very good. I'll put it. But yeah, we're not seeing it. So yeah.
Coming days out. Hello, bonjour, futsak, salam, kami, banjingam. I'm from the Australian government with a message for the world as we gather in Glasgow for this crucial climate summit. Fuck you. Over the coming days, our prime marketer will be there trying to shake a lot of hands and saying a lot of blah, 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 like we're reducing emissions and net zero by 2050. But for those of you not fluent in Cantonese, the official language of the Australian government, what he's saying is, fuck you. We'll keep digging, burning and exporting fossil fuels, let you do the hard work and then take all the credit. Fick dik ins knie. We have lots of experience at this because that's what we do back home, where we let the states and territories build renewables, subsidise EVs and retire coal plants, while we obstruct renewables, shit-talk EVs and subsidise coal plants, and then take credit for reducing emissions. We even take credit when those reductions are due to policies the opposition introduced when it was in office. Policies we scrapped, causing emissions to rise again. Sometimes we even take credit for things nobody does, like carbon credits for not clearing land that wasn't ever going to be cleared anyway. If a tree isn't cut down in a forest, does it make a sound? Why, yes. Cha-ching. All that might sound like we do nothing, but we're actually very busy. Our Environment Minister just opened 3 coal mines in a single month, whilst appealing a court ruling that she has a duty of care towards children over climate change. And our Minister for Emission Reduction, yes, that's really his title, is supporting massive new gas projects that'll contribute a cubic shit ton of emissions to the world not meeting the Paris target. The equivalent of 46 more coal plants. That's 3 more than the 43 new coal plants China's planning to build. We really are overachievers. Or as you Italians might say, siamo dei gran stronzi. What's that? How can we be expanding fossil fuels now that we've announced net zero by 2050? Oh, sweetheart, we can precisely because of net zero by 2050. Does it come with a policy? Nope. Is it binding? Nope. Does it rely on technologies that work or even fucking exist? Nah. But does it distract from what we're doing this decade? You betcha. And don't think we're the only ones. Am I right, Norway? Nice huge gas exports you got there. Hey, Canada, America, loving that Line 3 pipeline you guys just expanded. UK, nice new oil rigs you got ready to go there in the North Sea. Russia, baby, we see you doing fuck all. And to all the other governments attending, we know you want to punch us in the face for obstructing every COP since Kyoto. But hey, as long as you keep buying our coal and gas exports, we know you secretly love us for it. Most Australians are profoundly ashamed of our climate shitfuckery, so don't blame them. Well, except the dickheads who keep voting for us. For them, we reserve our biggest fuck you of all with our technology, not taxes plan, which means you pay for bullshit technologies that greenwash fossil fuel companies and they keep paying no taxes. That's the Australian way. We hope you enjoy this summit. And if it fails, don't forget to thank Scotty from Coal Fondling and all of us here at the Australian government. Allez-vous faire foutre? Alo ai gai. Jesteś majkojowi. Authorized by the Department for blah, blah, blah.
So I think, yeah, you can stop that, Ken. Yeah, so I think that's a pretty good illustration of, some of the realities behind, again, in a very funny way, of course, behind, yes, the government, actual government policies, which is, well, we all know, are completely inadequate. And again, we just keep putting off to the, distant future that, net zero by 2040 or 2050 or whatever. But, with no actual, set legal goals that would get us there. So, I think it's a pretty good illustration of the actual, well, again, we know we keep, with all these conferences, they're always inadequate in the end. They don't get enough. Even the promises aren't met in the end. And right now we're seeing more and more signs that more and more methane is getting released by melting ice and the here and there melting permafrost. Oh, plus of course there's the albedo effect from melting ice in Australia. Antarctica and the Arctic. So we're marching closer and closer towards having 2 or 3 degrees centigrade at least baked in, to the point where anything we do later on is not going to matter. So I'll end there, but and that's obviously a big issue that we can talk more about. Other clip I had is China going back and now boosting coal production because of the energy problems they've been having recently, and wanting to shore up their economy because of that. So obviously they're backsliding on their climate promises too. And it's just a mess generally. So I know what other comments people might have again on how basically how screwed we are by our own governments.
Well, let's hear from Frank.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to share that video. Okay. I have it. Just give me a moment to share it. China.
To boost production.
Going back to the beginning.
China has ordered coal miners to boost production. President Xi racing to combat an energy crisis now threatening to slow the world's second largest economy. And it's going to force his administration to backtrack off his climate change promises. Do you think? I will tell you that everybody is going to be backtracking by the end of this year. You can't continue to cut production, carbon outputs by not producing and not dramatically impact the economy, all for the sake of appeasing the intelligentsia of Hollywood. It is amazing. So I know that even the intelligentsia of Hollywood wants their air conditioning to continue to run, or their heat in Northern California to continue to run. You cannot cut something unless you are ready to replace it. Don't cut something in hopes.
What happened? You lost that?
What happened, Ken?
Okay, yeah, I cut that guy. That was the most.
Who is he anyway?
I'm gonna play. Yeah, that was like 3 weeks ago. Other things are like 5 years ago, a year ago.
And Ken, who is he? Because I've never seen him before.
Oh, that guy is I don't know, Dan Celia, Celia, Financial Issues. Maybe just an independent guy with that book, God Cancel Culture. But there's most of this stuff is from a year ago, about will China be able to overcome its coal addiction? Drones, 7 years ago and 5 days ago, but this is like 20 minutes long. And these are the motorcycle guys. I know them. They drive around China and, reveal things. So there's a lot of information about it. But yes, China's building coal plants. And I heard a thing in the news today or yesterday that the U.S. is increasing its coal usage. And, that's a little bit embarrassing for Biden at the convention. So, but in regards to all of that we saw from Australia, which I concur, everybody concurs, it's a charade. What do we do? What the hell do we do? You want to make Greta Thunberg, president of the United Nations? Because there's a lot of lives that will be lost if you just get rid of the coal and you try to push towards recycling.
Wow. Not I don't know about lives, Ken. Jobs, certainly.
Jobs, lives too. Because if there's no heat, there's no air. People die from hot and cold. I think they die there's more deaths from cold weather than hot weather. And then there's like the supply lines. If you're not going to feed energy to the ships to move the food and so forth, the tractors, and we got a whole infrastructure designed to support a population of 7.5 billion people, and it runs on petrol. So
at the same time, Ken, how are you guys in LA going to live when you deplete all the aquifers? Where are you going to get your water to stay alive?
Yeah,
there's issues like that.
Well, hopefully the science will come up with gills, and we'll be able to dive into the ocean. I'm not giving you an answer. I don't know. I'm not being facetious. I'm not saying we shouldn't handle it. I'm just trying to say who's got a policy. They get things done in China very effectively because it's a totalitarian government. So this is the train. We're building it like this. Shut up, get out of the way, do it, go to work. They're very effective as long as they do the right thing, as long as they don't cause a famine with planting trees upside down or something. But I'd say we're not in a totalitarianism in here. So it's hard to convince people to stop eating avocados. There's a major problem with avocados, an environmental problem with avocados, but they're very popular. But it's creating, deterioration of the environment in Mexico. So, but Jim, is there an answer to the profound stupidity? Oh, that's got to be Mike. That's Mike. We've been attacked by Mike. Mike, I'll turn you on in a minute. I don't know why it goes crazy like that. But let's go to Jim and then Frank and Michael.
Well,
Jim.
first of all, China has increased due to a whole bunch of issues their coal production. They actually had several years of decline in coal production, and the past couple of quarters, they had to order coal production to go up. And the area where they have one of the largest areas of coal production is Mongolia. They've actually ordered many mines to boost output. And they want actually mining production for their own economy to go up dramatically in the final quarter of 2021. So obviously that would not go too well in Glasgow if all these countries were there. And they're stockpiling in the northeastern provinces enough coal to support large amounts of electricity usage, about 24 days of electricity usage in the Northeast. They increase the power of electricity with provinces with higher demand. They also are, of course, one thing I learned a long time ago about China was they were the leader in electricity, in hydro and wind turbines. I remember listening to a discussion about this probably 20 years ago at the Council on Foreign Relations, where they were viewed as actually ahead of us in all those different kinds of experiments of alternative fuel. But their economy is such that they will not meet the 2030 goal of knocking down their coal production. And Kerry today made a comment about this in Glasgow where he said, well, if they increase it and don't cut it down by 2030, in order to meet the 1.5 centigrade goal by 2050, all the other countries in the world would have to have zero emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that's impossible to see happen, given the issues. The other point to break is that there are literally millions of people involved in the industry in China, and you have on average 11 people per 10,000 tons of coal output employed in around the entire country, and in some cases you have even larger amounts of people employed. So what are you going to do with those people? It's sort of like the kind of questions that arise when we had the guy on from West Virginia. What do you do when people are employed in high jobs where they make a lot of money? In the case of West Virginia, they make $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year. And then, okay, you can't work anymore in those kind of jobs because it's going to cripple the world because of global warming. In the case of China, they estimate that the coal sector, as of 2020, employed less than 3 million people. So they have reduced the amount of people working in it by back in 2013, it was 5.29 million. However, the same kind of problems apply in China that apply everywhere else in the world. Why should you cut your economic growth due to the fact that, the West tells you to? And that's how Xi Jinping is reacting.
Okay, great. So, Michael, I'm going to mute everybody. So don't ask, am I not muted? I'm going to mute everybody and unmute you.
Okay, good. First of all, anybody who talks about the Hollywood intelligentsia probably has to have an IQ in single digits. I mean, I've worked in the theater, film, and television business for several decades, not several in the literal sense, but since the late 70s, early 80s. And I can tell you something. You wouldn't put the words Hollywood and intelligentsia together unless you didn't know what the fuck you were talking about. So, okay, this guy's a moron. We already know it. But the fact is that we're in a situation now. We can sit here and saying, well, we can't give up. I mean, if we get rid of coal, we can't give up jobs. We have to have a new technology to replace it. Nature, Mother Nature, we'll call it, doesn't give a shit. It's going to do what it's going to do. And basically, if we're going to, if it's going to go up to even 2 degrees, a 2 degree centigrade global temperature rise, it's going to cause massive upheavals and millions of deaths. Millions, if not tens of millions of deaths. And the fact is, it's just going to go on and on and on until, if I may, use an ironic pun here, until we're cooked. I mean, the fact of the matter is, science, nature, doesn't give a shit about what our concerns are. We've done something. We've gone on a course in which we've screwed up nature to a large degree, or we've screwed with it. Perhaps not realizing it at the beginning for whatever reason. But we've done it. We've made our beds, and now we're going to have to sweat in them. Now, the fact of the matter is, something's going to have to be done. And if we don't have the technology to replace it, whose fault is that? We're just going to have to make the sacrifices, and we're going to have to do what we're going to do if we want our civilization or human civilization to survive. It may even get to the point if we want life on Earth to survive. It's not something where you can't negotiate with the natural world. It's not interested in compromising.
I think we got it, Mike. We got it. You're making the point over and over again. So, Frank, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, to show how bad it really is, if you look at Greta Thunberg, she's 18 years old and only 4'11". That's how bad it is. But there is a skepticism in this COP26 that is, I think, across the media. And, if we look at it, compared to what we were just talking about, Taiwan. I mean, there are certain realities in the world. At certain times, you have to look at what is, from a pragmatic point of view, what really is driving the train. And the guy just said that the United States is the leading economy in the world. No, it isn't. According to purchasing power parity, China is with 23 trillion. We're next with 19. Okay, in order for them to get whatever Xi Jinping wants, he's going to do whatever is necessary within his lifespan. All right, so that means yes, he's going to have coal plants. And India, Modi just said it's not going to happen till 2070 when they're going to reach any kind of reduction. 2070 is like, forget about it. So he's got their economy is around about 8 trillion.
Oh, sorry, Frank, was that 2017?
2070. 2070. 2070 is when, yeah. So they're taking this with facetiously, really. So here we have Modi saying that with their economy is 8 trillion, and they've stated flat out that they're not going to reduce their coal output; they're going to increase it. So, these are certain realities that you have to come to grips with. And I'm looking at the BBC, and yes, there has been a breakthrough in deforestation. But another Greta Thunberg joke, which I quite like, is what's her last words going to be? Mr. Bolsonaro, I can see your house from here. That's an old joke. But anyway, deforestation is absolutely essential to reduce in obviously Brazil, because apparently the Amazon is emitting more carbon than it's absorbing now because of what they've been doing. This is catastrophic. So, and if you look at Bangladesh, parts of its coast are now swamped with the seawater. So they've got 5 million people who cannot subsist anymore on what they used to. So these are examples of what's going on. But I was looking at the BBC, and there is a cynical attitude there, I guess. I don't know, within the media. They were going to connect to COP26, and when they do so, you see Biden asleep in the chair. He's like snoozing, and then they didn't make a connection once. So what did they go to? They went to an Israeli woman, a politician who's crippled. Okay, and there's a good 10-minute segment on why they hadn't got a ramp for her to get into COP26. And then she went on to a dialogue as to why it's important for people who are challenged like that to be able to go to things. I mean, what's that got to do with COP26? Nothing, right? So, my opinion is that there are certain things that possibly can be done. Certainly there's technology. It is actually cheaper now to do certain things like wind and solar than it is to do it with actually coal. But it needs infrastructure. And of course, that's another issue here. I mean, whether that's going to be passed to the requisite amount of money that needed to alter our aspirations as far as reducing carbon emissions. So, bottom line, Xi Jinping says we're going to take Taiwan by 2027. Forget about carbon emissions. I'm not going to this COP26. It's ludicrous. There are other realities. That's my opinion.
Okay, thanks, Frank. Okay, everybody's come up on this. Jim, I think we should go to a clip that you recommended, which is, what's his name? Yeah, one of my favorite people, Glenn Greenwald, talking about Edward Snowden and the secrets of national security state.
Well, we're at 10:45. Maybe we should call it a day because we're at the time. Unless you guys want.
We are? Okay, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Is everybody okay?
Yeah, we can continue tomorrow. Anyway, you've been listening to Going Viral.news. This is the November 2nd edition. We had on Brian Hsu from New Bloom magazine in Taiwan. We talked with him for an hour, and we've had the great pleasure of having Frank Radford, Michael Jankowitz, Alex Stavropoulos, myself, Jim Dingeman, and of course Ken Aaron, West Coast to East Coast, on for this edition of Going Viral, GoingViral.news. I want to thank everybody tonight, and let's talk again tomorrow. Stay tuned.